There's a patch of clover in your backyard right now that has survived 2 rounds of herbicide, an entire summer of mowing, and probably a few afternoons of you on your knees pulling it out by hand. And it's still there, still spreading, still winning. You're not imagining it. You're not doing anything wrong. And you're definitely not alone. Clover is one of the most herbicide-resistant weeds that shows up in ordinary American lawns, and almost nobody understands why, because almost nobody has ever been told what clover actually is. Not a weed in the way dandelions or plantain are weeds. Something closer to an opportunist, a plant that's been quietly exploiting a weakness in your soil that your grass can't defend against, no matter how much herbicide you throw at it. This is the story. That weakness, why the bottle in your garage keeps failing to fix it, and how the actual solution to your clover problem has probably been sitting in your kitchen cabinet this whole time, doing nothing, waiting for you to have any idea what it's capable of. Let's start with the failure, because that's where most people's understanding of clover begins and ends. You spray it. Within a few days, the leaves curl, darken at the edges, look convincingly dead. You feel that small satisfaction of a problem solved. And then, 3 weeks later, new clover shoots are pushing up in the exact same footprint, sometimes denser than before, like the herbicide application never happened at all. The lawn care industry has an answer for this, and it's the answer that keeps you buying more bottles. They'll tell you that you didn't apply enough, or that you need a different formulation, a stronger concentration, a specialized clover killer, instead of a general broadleaf mix. And so you buy the upgrade, and the upgrade fails too, in the same way, on the same timeline. Here's what nobody in that aisle is going to tell you. The problem was never the strength of the chemical. The problem is that herbicide is fighting the wrong battle entirely. It's designed to disrupt a plant's hormonal growth regulation until the plant essentially grows itself to death. And for most broadleaf weeds, that mechanism works beautifully. Dandelions die, plantain dies, chickweed dies, but clover has something none of those plants have. Something built into its root system that gives it a kind of biological insurance policy against exactly this kind of attack. To understand what that is, you have to understand what clover actually is. And to understand that, you have to go back to a question almost nobody asks. Why does clover show up in some lawns and not others? It's not random. It's not blowing in on the wind and just happening to land in your yard more than your neighbor's 3 houses down. Clover appears in one very specific condition, and once you know what that condition is, you'll start to see your entire clover problem completely differently. Clover shows up where soil is starved of nitrogen. Grass needs nitrogen constantly and in large quantities. Nitrogen builds the proteins and chlorophyll that let grass grow thick, dark, and dense enough to physically choke out anything trying to establish nearby. That density is your lawn's real defense system, not the products you spray on it. A lawn with abundant soil nitrogen grows into a mat so tight that weed seeds landing on it never even reach bare soil. They sit on top of the canopy, get no light, and die before they ever have a chance. But in nitrogen-poor soil, that defense collapses. Grass grows thin, pale, patchy, unable to close its own gaps. And into those gaps moves clover, because clover doesn't need what your grass needs. Clover has evolved something almost no other common lawn plant has: a living partnership buried in its own root system. Every clover plant hosts colonies of a bacteria called rhizobia inside small nodules along its roots. And rhizobia does something extraordinary. It pulls nitrogen directly out of the atmosphere, the same air surrounding your yard right now, and converts it chemically into a form the clover plant can absorb and use. Scientists call this nitrogen fixation, and it means clover essentially runs its own private fertilizer factory underground, completely independent of whatever nitrogen is or is not available in your soil. This is why clover thrives in exactly the conditions where your grass is failing. It is not competing with your grass for the same resource. It is operating on a completely different supply chain, one your grass has no access to at all. While your lawn is thin and starving in nitrogen-poor dirt, clover is sitting there manufacturing its own food, unaffected, expanding into every open space your struggling grass leaves behind. And this is also exactly why herbicide keeps failing against it. When you spray a broadleaf killer, you're attacking the visible plant, the leaves and stems above ground, disrupting the hormonal signaling that keeps the plant's growth in balance. For most weeds, that's a fatal blow because the whole plant collapses once that system breaks down. But clover's root nodules and their bacterial partnership function almost like a separate organ, capable of surviving significant damage to the top growth. You kill the leaves. The nodule network, underground, largely undisturbed, regenerates the plant from below, often within weeks. You're not failing to apply enough herbicide. You're attacking a plant that has a backup system herbicide was never designed to reach. So if clover's advantage is its independence, its ability to manufacture its own nitrogen regardless of what's happening in the surrounding soil, the real question becomes obvious. What happens if you could interrupt that manufacturing process itself? Not the leaves, not the visible plant, the actual underground chemistry that makes clover's survival possible in the first place. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn, because the answer isn't a chemical at all. It's a carbohydrate. Specifically, it's cornstarch. The same white powder sitting in almost every kitchen cabinet in America, used for thickening gravy and sauces, completely unrelated in the public imagination to anything involving weed control. The science behind why cornstarch affects clover has actually been documented and understood by agricultural researchers for decades, just never in a context that made it into a YouTube search result for how to kill clover. It comes down to something called nitrogen immobilization, and it's a phenomenon farmers have dealt with for over a century, usually as an unwanted side effect rather than an intentional tool. Here's what happens. Soil is full of bacteria that break down organic material. When you introduce a concentrated dose of pure carbohydrate into that soil, those bacteria essentially go into a feeding frenzy. Their population explodes, and like every living organism, that explosive growth requires nitrogen to build bacterial proteins. So the bacteria start aggressively pulling nitrogen directly out of the surrounding soil to fuel their own reproduction. Farmers have documented this for generations whenever they till fresh, carbon-rich material like straw or sawdust into their fields. Crops planted nearby often show temporary yellowing, not because the soil lacks nitrogen in absolute terms, but because the bacteria have essentially locked it away in a form the crop can't access, at least temporarily. Now apply that same principle specifically to clover. Remember, clover's rhizobia partnership depends on a very particular kind of soil environment, one that's relatively low in available nitrogen. This isn't incidental, it's actually how the whole relationship is regulated. Fixing nitrogen out of thin air is metabolically expensive for the clover plant. It takes enormous amounts of energy to run that process. So clover has evolved to essentially throttle its own nitrogen-fixing activity when the surrounding soil already has plenty of nitrogen available through normal channels. Because at that point, running the expensive internal factory is wasteful. When a sudden bacterial population boom occurs around clover's roots, two things happen simultaneously. The general soil bacteria and the specialized rhizobia inside the nodules end up competing directly for the same nitrogen resources and the same physical root space, destabilizing the very partnership clover depends on. And the surrounding nitrogen chemistry shifts in a way that actively interferes with the formation of new nodules on new root growth. Mature clover plants become stressed. New clover trying to spread through runners or establish from seed struggles to build the underground infrastructure it needs to survive at all. Your grass, meanwhile, experiences something entirely different. Because grass draws nitrogen directly through its root hairs rather than manufacturing it internally, the temporary lockup caused by the bacterial bloom is a short-lived inconvenience rather than an existential threat. And that lockup doesn't last. Within a few weeks, as the bacterial population stabilizes and begins dying back, all the nitrogen it had absorbed gets released back into the soil through normal decomposition, right in the root zone where your grass is positioned to use it. So the same intervention that destabilizes clover ends up delivering a nitrogen benefit to your lawn a few weeks later. This is the part that makes the whole mechanism so different from anything sold in a bottle. Herbicide is a chemical assault designed to kill on contact. Cornstarch does something almost the opposite. It redirects an existing, entirely natural biological cycle that's already running underneath every lawn in the country, and it tilts that cycle in favor of the plant that actually needs the nitrogen your soil eventually releases, while temporarily disadvantaging the plant that was only there because it didn't need that nitrogen in the first place. There's a reason this understanding never made it into mainstream lawn care advice, and it isn't because the science is obscure or unproven. Soil microbiologists have understood nitrogen immobilization since the early 20th century. It's taught in agricultural science programs. The reason it never reached homeowners is much simpler. There's no business model in telling people to use a $1 box of cornstarch instead of a $30 bottle of branded herbicide that has to be repurchased every single season because it structurally cannot solve the underlying problem. An industry built on recurring purchases has no incentive to explain why the recurring purchase keeps failing. I want to share what this looked like in a real lawn, because the theory only means so much until you see how slowly and unglamorously it actually plays out. There was a section of backyard, roughly 300 square feet, that had gone almost entirely to clover. Not scattered patches you could still call grass with weeds mixed in. A solid mat, thick enough that you genuinely couldn't find blades of grass underneath it. It had already survived 2 separate applications of a name brand broadleaf herbicide the previous summer. Both times, the same pattern. Wilting within days, full regrowth within a month. After introducing cornstarch to the soil around that patch, the first week showed essentially nothing. No dramatic wilting like you'd see with an iron-based treatment, no visible sign that anything had changed at all. It would have been easy to write the whole thing off as another failed experiment. By day 10, something subtle started to shift. The clover's leaves lost some of their glossy, deep green color. They looked slightly duller, slightly smaller, not dead, but visibly stressed in a way that was easy to miss unless you were specifically looking for it. By week 4, after a second round, the mat had noticeably thinned. Bare soil started appearing between clumps that had been a solid green carpet weeks earlier. And in those gaps, thin blades of grass began pushing through. Grass that had clearly been sitting there the entire time, suppressed underneath the clover canopy, simply waiting for light and root space to finally become available. By week 8, the clover coverage in that patch had dropped from close to total to somewhere around 15%. The grass that had been struggling underneath for years was finally filling back in on its own, not because anything had been planted, but because the condition that had let clover dominate that space had been removed. The total cost of the intervention across the entire 8-week period came out to less than $2. A single box of cornstarch, most of it still left over. Compare that to roughly $50 spent the previous year on 2 rounds of branded herbicide that did nothing but wilt the leaves temporarily before the clover rebuilt itself from the roots. The $1.50 solution didn't just outperform the $50 solution, it solved a problem the $50 solution was never structurally capable of solving in the first place. What this story really illustrates is a lesson that extends well beyond clover, and it's a lesson worth sitting with if you've ever felt like you're fighting your lawn instead of caring for it. Clover was never actually the problem. Clover was a symptom, a visible signal broadcasting a much less visible fact about the soil underneath your feet. It was telling you, in the only language it has, that your soil didn't have enough available nitrogen to let your grass compete on its own terms. Herbicide treats the signal. It kills the messenger while leaving the underlying condition completely untouched, which is exactly why the clover keeps coming back, season after season, bottle after bottle, like clockwork. You're not failing to kill it hard enough. You're killing the wrong thing entirely. Address the actual imbalance in the soil, and you're not just removing clover from view for a few weeks. You're removing the specific set of conditions that made your lawn vulnerable to clover, colonizing it in the first place. That's the real difference between suppressing a symptom and correcting the cause underneath it, and it's a difference that a spray bottle, no matter how strong the concentration, was never built to address. There's something almost poetic about the fact that the fix for a problem the lawn care industry has spent decades monetizing turns out to be sitting quietly in a kitchen cabinet the entire time, ordinary, unmarketed, completely overlooked, because there was never a profit margin big enough to justify telling anyone about it. Clover isn't beating your grass because it's stronger. It's winning because it found the one gap in your soil that your grass couldn't close on its own, and no amount of chemical firepower aimed at the leaves was ever going to close that gap for it. If you've spent years fighting clover with products that keep failing in exactly the same way, that failure was never really about the product's strength. It was about fighting the wrong part of the plant, and now you understand why.